The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History magazine. The arrival of television to the Nebraska Panhandle in the 1950s sparked an unexpected showdown between state and local officials, an influential Wyoming broadcaster, and the National Park Service. Today, we learn more about the controversy through the 1996 Nebraska History magazine article, Scotts Bluff National Monument and the Coming of Television to the Nebraska Panhandle, written by Phil Roberts. Until 1955, few Nebraska Panhandle homes had television sets. The nearest station, KFBC TV, was located nearly 100 miles to the southwest in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and provided only poor reception to a handful of North Platte Valley television owners. With more than 50,000 people in the valley, however, it seemed inevitable that television broadcasting would come eventually. But potential viewers could hardly have predicted how its arrival would pit local officials, the congressional delegations of two states, and a politically powerful Wyoming media company against the National Park Service. A decade earlier, Wyoming's congressional delegation had been bogged down in a fight with the National Park Service over creation of Jackson Hole National Monument. In that case, local residents in Teton County convinced the delegation that the monument interfered with local economic activity. In this new controversy, whose locale was just outside Wyoming's borders at the opposite end of the state, historic preservation was pitted against good television reception. In 1955, the Federal Communications Commission approved an application from Frontier Broadcasting Company of Cheyenne, Wyoming, to build a television tower in Scottsbluff County, Nebraska. The company owned KFBC TV, the weak signals from which furnished the only television reception in the North Platte Valley. A technical report commissioned by the company concluded, quote, "It is our belief that the proposed transmitter installation on Scottsbluff National Monument is the only feasible and practical location for the dissemination of television to the Scottsbluff area, which does now not enjoy television programming," end quote. The report added that the site, quote, "would not be obtrusive or in any way detract from the Scottsbluff National Monument as a recreation area or viewing point," end quote. Following extensive engineering studies, the company decided that placement of the tower on top of Scotts Bluff would provide extensive coverage of the North Platte Valley and allow the signal to reach communities beyond. Frontier Broadcasting was controlled by Cheyenne publisher Tracy McCracken. From the 1920s until his death in 1960, McCracken was a power in Wyoming publishing and politics. A native of Illinois, McCracken graduated from the University of Wyoming in 1917 and became editor of the Laramie Boomerang. Later, he was private secretary to Governor William Ross, leaving that position to serve in a similar capacity for Democratic U.S. Senator John B. Kendrick. Wyoming's capital city had no newspaper loyal to the Democrats when Kendrick faced re-election in 1922. After a successful campaign, despite having no press support in the capital city, the wealthy Sheridan County cattlemen who owned other newspapers in the state decided to establish such an organ in Cheyenne. The result was the Wyoming Eagle, first published May 28, 1925. It was a weekly designed to boost the election of Democrats. P.J. Kinney, a Newcastle car dealer, furnished the plant, and Theodore Wannerus, a former Kendrick aide, was named editor. Wannerus, who edited the paper for almost a year, made the Eagle editorially respectable, but it remained a weak competitor to the statewide Republican-oriented daily, the Wyoming State Tribune. McCracken left Washington in October 1926 to take over the editorship of the Eagle, where he continued strong editorial support for Kendrick's fellow Democrat, Governor Nellie Taylor Ross. Even with the Eagle's support, however, the first woman elected governor in any state lost her bid for re-election that November. The elections over, McCracken concentrated on building up the business side of the operation. gradually gaining control of the Eagle from Kendrick and from Kinney's heirs. Within a decade, McCracken had built the Eagle into a competitive daily, mostly through advertising promotions and innovative subscription campaigns. It didn't hurt the paper's standing when Democrats were swept into office with the New Deal, including McCracken's former colleague on Kendrick's staff, Joseph C. O'Mahony, who became U.S. Senator on Kendrick's death. The two men were to remain lifelong political allies. While the Eagle remained rooted in Cheyenne, the larger Tribune lost money in the Depression years of the 1930s by continuing as, quote, Wyoming's statewide newspaper, end quote. In 1939, following an ownership change which plunged the Wyoming State Tribune into deeper financial difficulties, McCracken rescued the older daily and merged it into his growing media empire. Unlike the usual publisher, however, McCracken opted not to change the editorial direction of the Tribune. It would remain Republican and would consequently sew up a newspaper monopoly for McCracken in Cheyenne. At the same time, Republican politicians knew who owned the Republican paper in the state capital, providing McCracken with a unique political situation. Partisans of both parties depended on his editorial voice. The political connections set the stage for McCracken's moves into the broadcast media, which, unlike newspapers, were regulated by the Federal Communications Commission. Although the first radio broadcasting station opened to Wyoming in 1926 as a nonprofit operation in Laramie, commercial radio began 4 years later in Casper. Oddly, it was another 10 years before a radio station was started in the state capital. McCracken apparently failed to see the financial potential of radio broadcasting, and in October 1940, a young couple opened KYAN, a small radio station in Cheyenne. Almost immediately, the McCracken newspapers felt the advertising heat generated by businesses captivated by the new media. Within 3 months, McCracken, through the help of his friends in the Wyoming congressional delegation, gained FCC approval for a competing station. KYAN didn't stand a chance. 6 months after the McCracken-owned station went on the air, the older station went off the air. McCracken's station dominated the market for the next 2 decades. When television broadcasting began gaining national attention in the early 1950s, McCracken had learned his lesson about new technologies. In 1954, he obtained a television broadcast license for Cheyenne, even though the town had a population of less than 30,000 people. It was by far the smallest market in the United States to be granted its own station. The station made little economic sense in such a small community. Consequently, McCracken's company, Frontier Broadcasting, the owner of KFBC-TV, opted to develop new markets through the use of translator stations to rebroadcast the flagship station's programming into homes far from the signal's origin. Denver television stations had already tied up the markets just south of Cheyenne in northern Colorado, so Frontier decided to place its first translator in the Nebraska Panhandle, where no television existed except for KFBC's own weak signal. The additional viewers would enable the station to secure a good schedule of network programs. The FCC approval came quickly in the summer of 1954 when the commission approved the proposed station at KSTF-TV to broadcast on Channel 10. The initial license request indicated that the transmitter would be located about 10 miles south of the town of Scotts Bluff. Sometime during the late summer of 1954, engineers working for Frontier Broadcasting reported that the proposed location had not taken into account that the huge bluff from which the town and county had gained their names would block television reception to a significant number of potential viewers. The engineers suggested locating the tower on top of the bluff instead. There was a minor problem with that location, however. The top of the bluff was part of Scotts Bluff National Monument, administered by the National Park Service. Park Service approval would be essential in order to proceed with the location change. On July 29, 1954, KFBC General Manager William C. Grove wrote to Senator Frank Barrett's administrative assistant, Louis E. Bates, asking for the senator's help in gaining the necessary clearance. Is it possible to build on a national monument? The company needed to know soon because it did not wish to build in winter. An unsigned note, apparently to support a telephone conversation, indicated it was not against the law, but it was up to the National Park Service. After contacting officials in the Park Service, Bates discovered that what had seemed at first a simple matter might be more complicated. He said, quote, "I learned this morning that there is some resistance to the use of the monument areas for such purposes, so you may be confronting a wrestling match on this," end quote. He added that it was worth trying because the area is teleblind. The same day, Bates was writing Grove about the possible resistance. Grove again wrote to Barrett's office, stressing that the best location for the tower would be on top of the monument. He also asked if it would be possible to add a small building at the site. Its, quote, "architecture to conform to the entrance gate station," end quote, of the National Monument, and to be mostly hidden from view. Grove reiterated that the monument was the only suitable location for the tower. Bates forwarded the request to Conrad L. Worth, director of the National Park Service, on September 22, 1954. Worth responded 9 days later that the service had turned down similar requests and was doing so in this case as well. Neither Frontier Broadcasting nor Senator Barrett's office was willing to accept Worth's decision. Even though Bates remained the main contact in Barrett's office, another Barrett aide, Mary Bruner, called Director Worth in mid-October, asking for Park Service approval. This time, Worth wrote directly to Barrett, stating, quote, "I believe you will agree with me, Frank, that if we should allow the company to install a television antenna within the boundaries of an area of the National Park System, we would be immediately flooded with similar requests, the granting of any one of which would be contrary to the basic principles and concept of the laws creating the National Park Service," end quote. Barrett forwarded the response to Grove and added a brief note indicating that it appeared another site would have to be found. Grove responded, quote, "It would serve no purpose to have a station constructed there on an uneconomical basis and then be forced to discontinue after a few months of operation," end quote. Frontier Broadcasting had hoped to invest less than $100,000 to put the Scottsbluff station on the air. Grove added that if the company could not broadcast from atop Scottsbluff, a 900-foot tower would be necessary, costing $200,000. Meanwhile, Frontier Broadcasting was busy marshaling local support in the Nebraska Panhandle for the station and the proposed tower site. O.B. Korfer, KFBC co-manager, who also served on the staff of McCracken's newspapers as general manager, sent a telegram to the mayor of Scottsbluff specifying the language for a resolution to be sent to the Park Service and to Congress. The Frontier written resolution endorsed the monument as the transmitter site, quote, "to the end that our people will have the advantages of this great electronic miracle," end quote. In October 1954, a flurry of letters and resolutions from civic organizations in Nebraska and in Goshen County, Wyoming, began arriving in the offices of Senators Barrett and O'Mahony, urging that they force the Park Service to reconsider. The issue was framed by questioning whether preservation of Scottsbluff would be adversely affected by construction of the tower, and even if it were, did preservation somehow merit greater consideration than quality television reception for 100,000 people? Letters were also sent to Park Service Director Worth. A typical one was from Percy F. Renner, mayor of Bridgeport, who told Worth that as a boy, quote, "I climbed the butte on foot. More recently, we climbed the butte by automobile. I do not think the paved roadway has spoiled the butte one bit," end quote. The mayor also asserted, quote, "Nor do I think will a TV antenna spoil the scenery," end quote. He offered an unusual perspective on public response to a television tower on Scottsbluff. He said, quote, "It might cause some people to take an interest in the monument who are not otherwise interested in history or scenery," end quote. Other letters from proponents of the tower location seemed inadvertently to undermine Frontier's position. E.M. Parker Jr. wrote, quote, "Many TV sets are already in operation in the Minutair area. However, reception is not very good," end quote. Parker Jr. served as president of the Minutair Lions Club. Willis A. Faith, mayor of Lyman, noted that the nearest station to his town was 90 miles away in Cheyenne. He wrote, quote, "It is hard for us to get good reception at times from there," end quote. Such comments suggest television reception may have been better in some areas of the North Platte Valley than McCracken's company wished to admit to government officials. Barrett recommended that petitions might have an effect. Consequently, Frontier Management circulated petitions throughout the proposed viewing area. In Torrington, one petition with 45 names had been, quote, "left in the newspaper office," end quote. Petitions also contained names of various civic clubs in Goshen County. One petition with 110 names was circulated by Torrington insurance man Fred C. Pearson. In late December, Senator O'Mahony announced plans for congressional hearings to be held concerning the tower matter. The senator wrote Grove explaining how the hearings would be structured, noting, quote, "I have assured, of course, that it would be impossible or at least too difficult to get a satisfactory signal into the area from any long-distance station," end quote. He told Grove that a television lawyer was not necessary because, quote, "this issue has nothing to do with television law," end quote. According to O'Mahony, the issue is whether or not the proposed tower would be such a blemish on the monument that it should be prohibited even at the cost of depriving a large number of people residing in western Nebraska the access to television. The hearing in Washington was set for January 10, 1955 in the Interior Department hearing room. Local officials from the Panhandle were scheduled to appear along with KFBC-TV station manager William Grove, who invited Senator Barrett to join the party for dinner at the Statler Hotel on the night before the hearing. Grove warned Barrett that Mr. Hacker of the Park Service, an attendant at Scottsbluff Monument, would suggest an alternative site. But he emphasized to Barrett, whose home was in Lusk, Wyoming, some 80 miles northwest of Scottsbluff, that, quote, "we cannot guarantee coverage of Lusk from the monument, but there is definitely a better chance from that from the other site," end quote. Park Service Director Conrad Worth presided at the hearing. Wyoming Senator Barrett and O'Mahony, Representative Keith Thompson, and Nebraska 4th District Representative A.L. Miller all attended in support of the company's application. Nebraska Senators Roman Hruska and Carl Curtis were invited but did not come to the hearing. The entire Wyoming delegation, along with Curtis, Hruska, and Miller from Nebraska, later signed a letter to Worth urging a favorable ruling. Otherwise, 35,000 people would be deprived of the opportunity to enjoy television. No one appeared in opposition, but the Park Service submitted a 6-page report from Coit H. Hackett, acting superintendent of Scottsbluff National Monument. In firm language, Hackett proposed an alternative site, noting that the Park Service had conducted, quote, "a survey of one such alternate site as the resources at our command would allow," end quote. He claimed that Frontier Broadcasting had failed to consider any site north of the North Platte River, and the Park Service's proposed location was, quote, "as good as, if not better than, the site desired on the summit of the monument," end quote. The Park Service's site, a 38.8-acre tract of unimproved grassland, 10.3 miles north-northeast from downtown Scottsbluff, was owned by Mrs. Dorothy E. Morrison, who consented to locating the tower on the site. Hackett pointed out the numerous benefits of the Morrison site, including proximity to a paved road. The Monument Road was not plowed the 1.6 miles from Monument headquarters to the summit during the winter, and also the availability of water, which none was available at the Monument site, as well as land enough for additional towers, including microwave facilities. Hackett also speculated about why McCracken's company desired the Monument site, writing, quote, "if the use of public property and public facilities maintained at federal expense in order to reduce the capital outlay of the promoters of the commercial venture and consequently a greater realization of profit are to be a consideration, then there is no comparable alternative site to the monument location," end quote. He reminded Worth of another problem with locating the tower on the monument. He wrote, quote, "man-made structures, such as a television antenna, are required by the Civil Aeronautics Administration to be painted with alternate bands of orange and white in addition to a blinking red light. It is inconceivable that such a structure could be made to blend in with the surrounding terrain under these conditions, end quote. In Hackett's view, the scenery would be irreparably damaged. Writing, quote, "The general view of the bluff as seen from the north side of the North Platte River has often been used by national publications on stories on the monument or the state of Nebraska. In the future, should Frontier erect their antenna and transmitter, their installation would be featured in similar photos," end quote. He added dryly, quote, "While this would generate a quantity of national publicity for Frontier Broadcasting and KSTF-TV, it is questionable if either the national publications or the general traveling public will feel that a television antenna has national significance," end quote. Despite Hackett's compelling report, Barrett felt the hearing had gone well for Frontier Broadcasting. He wrote Torrington businessman Pearson, who had been gathering signatures on petitions, that the Park Service director might change his mind. Writing, quote, "Worth told Rural Armstrong that we made out a very good case and that he is trying his level best to work out something which would be satisfactory to us," end quote. But Barrett's optimism was ill-founded. Unknown to the senator, Director Worth had received a memo from Vern E. Rowley, Park Service Supervisory Electronics Engineer. The report was devastating to the Frontier position. Rowley revealed that Frontier had conducted no transmission tests of any at the site, and that Grove apparently had relied on a report suggesting that the vertical surface of Scottsbluff would create undesirable ghosts in television transmissions. The Park Service's test, however, contradicted that position. On February 8, 1955, Worth again wrote Grove that he was denying the company's request. In a prepared statement, Barrett said that he was, quote, "distressed to learn of the decision," end quote. In one version of the statement, the Wyoming senator added, quote, "The historical significance of the monument is in the fact that it was a landmark in the early days of the West. It would take several atomic bombs to destroy that landmark, and it is hard to see how a tower less than 75 feet high could get that job done," end quote. Without identifying that Frontier Broadcasting was McCracken's company, his Wyoming State Tribune blasted the Park Service's decision editorially. Titled "Bureaucracy at its Worst," the editorial repeated Barrett's contention that the tower would not destroy the value, beauty, or significance of that landmark, and argued that the Park Service was attempting to deprive the Panhandle residents of quality television viewing. Writing, quote, "The Tribune, as readers will well recall, excoriated bureaucracy's great and mounting power and warned of the danger of that growth through all of the 20 years it was permitted under the Democrat administrations," end quote. The editorial thundered, quote, "Over and over again, the Tribune urged support of the Republican Party for that and various other reasons. Must we confess that the Republican Party can do no more about this than the Democrat Party?" End quote. The editorial concluded, quote, "Is there not a power in the Republican administration which can bring bureaus and bureaucrats to book?" End quote. Listed on the masthead, printed above the editorial, was the name of the Tribune's new editor, Lewis E. Bates, who had been the administrative assistant for Barrett during the beginning of the controversy. There was the expected outpouring of support for Frontier from Panhandle residents, coupled with corresponding denunciations of the Park Service's decision. Well-known University of Wyoming historian T.A. Larson wrote Barrett as a proponent of Frontier's proposal, writing, quote, "I want to compliment you on your stand with respect to Echo Park and the TV tower on Scottsbluff National Monument. I try to study each conversation question on its merits, and I am sure that you will do the same," end quote. The Scottsbluff Star-Herald applauded the Park Service's decision. The paper was skeptical of claims that the monument was the only feasible location for the tower, writing, quote, "A little distasteful, too, has been the open organization and application of political pressure to force a reversal of the historic principle of maintaining national monuments in their natural state," end quote. McCracken thanked Barrett for supporting the company's position, writing, quote, While you, Joe O'Mahony, and Wyoming Congressman Keith Thompson were unable to prevail upon the Park Service people to deviate from their usual bureaucratic thinking, I want all of you to know I am greatly appreciative of your efforts, end quote. However, he was not ready to concede defeat, writing, quote, I knew that we could make of our case an airtight and clinching one, but I was not convinced that this Bureau would judge the case on its merits, and it certainly hasn't. As a result of this narrow and selfish decision, which is so contrary to the best interests of the greatest number of people, the Panhandle will perhaps indefinitely or even forever be denied the advantages of television service, end quote. He then asked Barrett if he could arrange an appointment with the president, at which time an appeal to him would be made. Barrett replied that he had contacted J. Rural Armstrong, the Wyomingite serving as solicitor of the Department of the Interior, about the matter. Armstrong suggested not appealing the decision to the Secretary of the Interior until the Echo Park Dam issue was settled. O'Mahony wrote a similar letter. McCracken responded that it would be just plain unsafe to delay the matter. Quote, I am afraid some people in the Scottsbluff region would have a difficult time convincing themselves that any further postponement of action is something other than a stall on our part, end quote. He wrote to O'Mahony, bluntly stating that the community antenna people are again getting busy in Scottsbluff. McCracken was not giving up. He sent Corfer and Grove to Scottsbluff on February 18th to attend a junior Chamber of Commerce meeting. Barrett sent an airmail letter the next week, urging Frontier Broadcasting to seek a reversal of the decision at a higher level in the Interior. He noted that Armstrong and two other officials of the department are, quote, in our corner, end quote. He added that, quote, the secretary himself is inclined to go along also, but for some reason or other, they, the Interior, seem to be terribly afraid of the opposition from some of the so-called conservation organizations, end quote. In February, former U.S. Senator Clarence C. Dill of Washington wrote to Barrett pointing out, quote, I wrote the present law, and after quitting the Senate, I practiced radio law in Washington for several years, end quote. The former senator then told Barrett of a recent case in which he represented a television owner in Spokane, Washington, who had a site on top of Mount Spokane in the state park. He explained another station sued to remove it, but the court upheld the placement of the tower. He suggested that the case might serve as precedent in the Frontier case. But Barrett already had checked for precedents. There were several places where state park commissioners had allowed such towers, and he wrote Dill, quote, the Forest Service and BLM have done so, but nowhere has the National Park Service permitted such towers, end quote. The only hope was an appeal to higher authorities in the Interior Department or the Federal Communications Commission. In early March, Barrett wrote to the FCC asking, quote, whether or not the FCC had any authority to intervene or help in getting the National Park Service to agree to the location of the television tower, end quote. Mary Jane Morris, FCC Secretary, responded, quote, the Commission is fully appreciative of the problems confronting the above permittee in its efforts. However, the issuance of authority to locate a transmitter on Scottsbluff National Monument appears to lie exclusively within the jurisdiction of the National Park Service, and the Commission can only approve the location from an engineering standpoint, end quote. She reminded Barrett that the company's application did not specify the Scottsbluff National Monument as the location of the proposed transmitter site, but rather a site some 10 miles south of the city of Scottsbluff. Barrett turned to Interior Undersecretary Orm Lewis to review the Park Service's decision. While Frontier and Barrett waited for Lewis's reply, Rural Armstrong wrote to Barrett, including a copy of his lawyer's report, the Park Service engineer's report, and Frontier's statement, writing, quote, Worth says he rested his decision on the statute and not on the reports, however, end quote. The lawyer's report was not particularly favorable to Frontier's position. Written by Julian H. Golden, acting assistant solicitor for national parks, the report described the testimony at the hearings and later exhibits, indicating that, quote, many letters in the file are from persons who favor the granting of the application and many from persons who oppose it, end quote. Lewis finally made his decision and replied to Barrett on April 18th, noting that the record had been, quote, quite voluminous, and I found it necessary to devote the past weekend to it so that I might give it undivided attention, hence the delay in responding, end quote. He then reiterated Worth's decision, quote, my conclusion is that the very nature of the installation, contemplated and in its particular location within the boundaries of the national monument, is so much at variance with the fundamental purposes of establishing and preserving national monuments that it precludes a decision contrary of that of Mr. Worth, end quote. He concluded, therefore, the denial of the application must stand. Barrett sent a copy of Lewis's decision to Tracy McCracken, writing, quote, I know that it is a blow to KFBC TV, but I don't know what we can do about it, end quote. He also sent a copy to his former aide, Lou Bates, now the Tribune editor, writing, quote, I was dubious of the matter from the first, end quote. The matter was closed. The Park Service, historic preservation, and scenery had prevailed over television in yet another minor skirmish between conservation and profit. Nonetheless, television did come to Scotts Bluff and the Nebraska Panhandle. Ironically, Frontier Broadcasting located the tower for KSTF-TV 10 miles northeast of Scotts Bluff, near the site suggested by the Park Service, where the tower still stands. KSTF-TV went on the air June 1st, 1955, serving television viewers throughout the North Platte Valley without compromising the historical significance or the scenery of Scotts Bluff National Monument. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about the Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcast episodes, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and get notified when we release new episodes on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.